So, I would like to talk today about Nietzsche's philosophy of art, specifically the very critical ideas he developed in his 1878 work, Human All Too Human, and see whether and in what way Nietzsche ultimately came to revise at least some of his views in his later work from 1886, when he started to formulate ideas about perspectivism. Now, perhaps you know Nietzsche as a philosopher who in general is very sympathetic to the arts, and this I think is roughly very much true. But what is less known about Nietzsche's engagement with art is that during an important period of his thinking, the so-called middle period, Nietzsche entertained very critical ideas regarding art, artists, aesthetics, and formulated these ideas in sometimes extremely aggressive language, as his wont in general, you can say. So, first of all, to motivate my talk, at least partially, I would like to begin by quoting a few sentences from an interview recently given, and you can find it online if you're interested, it's very interesting, by another philosopher, the contemporary American philosopher Alexander Rosenberg. And Rosenberg, he's currently a professor of philosophy at Duke University, is a card-carrying adherent of the view that is called scientism. And what is scientism? Scientism is a term that is often used in a pejorative way, that is in a negative way, to refer to the approach that sees in the sciences, especially the natural sciences, that is biology, chemistry, physics, neurology, neuropsychology, sees in those sciences as the end-all and be-all of all rational inquiry. According to this approach, science enjoys exclusivity with respect to human beings' attempt to know anything at all. If there is a meaningful question there to be asked, it is the sciences and the sciences alone that have the legitimacy and authority to try to answer the question. And it is their answer and their answer alone that we can ever be rationally warranted in believing. So what is the nature of material existence? Did the universe have a beginning? What is the function of the brain, etc., etc.? With respect to any question that we can pose whatsoever, if there is some determinate answer to that question, if there is a truth to be found with respect to it, it is the sciences alone that can deliver it. And anyone else, layman, that is mere mortals, should bow down before science and accept its results unquestionably. As already mentioned, the term scientism usually has strong negative connotations for its users, since it is believed by those who oppose scientism that its overweening scientific imperialism is just wrong-headed or flat-out false. While extremely valuable, the sciences, so that the detractors of scientism hold, the sciences cannot possibly hope to answer every legitimate question. And the scientistic approach, in contrast to the scientific approach, the scientistic approach that seeks to delegitimize any question or suggestion that might threaten the exclusive hegemony of science by dismissing the question as meaningless, is nothing but intellectual terrorism. Rosenberg, while aware of the resistance to scientism, is not fazed by it at all. And I want to quote from the interview. And he says this: "So scientism, as the word is normally used, is a term of abuse. And what it means is the unreasonable and unwarranted crediting of science with powers to explain, that is, by many people, not so credited. And the exaggerated respect for science's methods and science's findings. Now take that definition and remove the word exaggerated, and you've got my definition of scientism. Scientism is the view that science is our best guide to the nature of reality. Its methods and its findings are our best account of the nature of reality." End quote. Now, in Rosenberg's view, when it comes to the fundamental philosophical questions we might be perturbed with, and which philosophers have dedicated themselves to for centuries, science has supplied us with the best available answers, which he powerfully lists in the following. So this is another quote. So, is there a God? Of course not. What is the meaning of the universe? Doesn't have any. What is the purpose of life? Ditto. Is there a difference between right and wrong, good and bad? There's not a moral difference between them. What is the nature of the relationship between mind and the brain? They're identical. The mind is the brain. Is there free will? Not a chance. So that's a nice list. Now, it is not my intention here to develop or challenge Rosenberg's ideas in any detail, though I will raise a challenge to scientism. So you might ask, why have I been talking about him and his problematic views? And what has that to do with Nietzsche and art? Well, what caught my attention in this interview with Rosenberg was the following exchange between him and his interviewer regarding the nature and value of artworks and aesthetic experience. So this is Rosenberg again. He says, I mean, the arts are fun. They are entertaining, they're enjoyable. It's like when you listen to Beethoven's Ninth and you hear the Ode to Joy. It makes you cry, okay? Nobody can deny that it makes you cry. Scientism doesn't deny it makes you cry. But to think there's some world historical meaning beyond the emotional impact of great works of art on us, that's what I think is the mistake, and the mistake that science reveals to us. And the interviewer goes on to ask, and science tells us that when we're moved by Beethoven's Ode to Joy, that's nothing more than an emotional response? And he answers, it's the acoustical disturbance produced by the condensation and rarefication of oxygen and nitrogen molecules in the atmosphere pushing on our eardrums. And when you say value, the interviewer asks, the value that it has is, for example, its ability to emotionally give us pleasant experiences? Yes, right. But nothing beyond that? No. Let me repeat the central claims here. Great art, Beethoven's Ninth, for example, makes you cry. It has an emotional impact. But there is no world historical meaning in it. It reveals no great secrets about the mysteries of life, the universe, and everything. Moreover, the effect of the work on us can be explained in purely scientific terms. Molecules, atmosphere, pressure. Now compare this to the following aphorism by Nietzsche. So here I'm finally starting with Nietzsche, entitled, Art Weighs Down the Thinker's Heart. It's taken from the section from the Soul of Artists and Writers in Nietzsche's 1878 Human All Too Human. So Nietzsche writes the following. We can understand how strong the metaphysical need is from the way the highest effects of art can easily produce a reverberation of a long silenced or even broken metaphysical string, even in a free spirit who has rid himself of everything metaphysical. At a certain place in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, for example, he might feel that he is floating above the earth in a starry dome with the dream of immortality in his heart. All the stars seem to glimmer around him and the earth seems to sink ever deeper downwards. In such moments, his intellectual character is being tested. End quote. You can now see, I hope, why, reading the Rosenberg interview, I became instantaneously intellectually sizzled and quickly reached to my copy of Nietzsche's text. For here, in essence, we have very similar ideas. Art, great art, Nietzsche tells us, can give rise in us to a great emotional response, the highest effects, as Nietzsche says, and might generate in us, as a result, the illusion that arts can communicate great metaphysical truths, or alternatively, reawaken in us metaphysical or religious notions that, as free spirits, we should have left behind as relics of an immature, pre-scientific, unenlightened age. Was then Nietzsche at the time of Human All Too Human an adherent of scientism of sorts? Well, he certainly would agree, I think, with Rosenberg at the time of Human All Too Human and all the way till the end of his career, that indeed life is meaningless, the universe is meaningless, there is no moral difference between what we call right and wrong, and that there is no God because, well, as Nietzsche famously put it, God is dead. But what about Nietzsche's view of art? And did it remain unchanged all the way until Nietzsche's final works? In the section I quoted above, Nietzsche mentions the free spirit or the free thinker. The free spirit was a new ideal that Nietzsche began to articulate in Human All Too Human and in the immediately following works. The term free spirit or free thinker represents for Nietzsche not what it has come sometimes to represent in our current topsy-turvy culture, namely the anti-science, anti-authority of every kind, who mocks those who trust the sciences for not being able to think for themselves and takes pride in being an independent, free thinker. No. For Nietzsche, it represents the philosopher or the thinker who is managed by means of the lessons of science, as well as by means of his scalpel-sharp reason, to free himself, and Nietzsche mostly had men in mind, but we should also add herself, from the shackles of irrational or erroneous belief. Every idea that smacks of something unnatural, supernatural, transcendent, that smells, as Nietzsche puts it, of the beyond, the hereafter, of another world beyond this world, every idea that whispers in our ear that the human being is more, is special, unique, divine, that there glows in him some magical spark, every such idea is to be put by the free spirit on ice, as Nietzsche puts it. Namely, on the basis of piercing psychological analysis, of which Nietzsche was a master, every idea, such as the ones that I mentioned, is to be deflated of its seeming grandiosity and of the humanistic enthusiasm that was breathed into it, and in a cold, dispassionate fashion, shown to be nothing but a result of certain errors of thinking passed down to us through the generations, nothing but the consequence of the working of certain natural psychological mechanisms now exposed for what they really are, namely the mechanisms of a finite, feeble, arrogant, credulous, and mendacious mind, a mind that is human, all too human. For example, while we may think that there's something supernatural or divine about morality, that the laws of morality are of pure or pristine origin and are therefore unconditional, Nietzsche avers in an aphorism entitled "The Super Animal," he says, "The beast in us wants to be lied to. Morality is a white lie to keep it from tearing us apart. Without the errors inherent in the postulates of morality, man would have remained an animal. But as it is, he has taken himself to be something higher and has imposed stricter laws upon himself. Morality, Nietzsche thus claims, is a lie. A lie, moreover, we tell ourselves. It is based on errors with the help of which we fancy ourselves to be more than a beast, and thus, on the basis of this self-deception, keep ourselves in check. While it is true that by means of morality, by means of this self-deception, we've become a super animal, we remain animals nonetheless, not beings of a higher divine order. Besides morality, in the course of the Free Spirit book series, Nietzsche subjects a whole variety of different beliefs to this cold analysis. Religious beliefs, metaphysical, political beliefs, as well as, and this is the focus of my talk today, beliefs that concern art and aesthetics, for these too must, in frosty scientific spirit, be debunked and shown to be the result of mythical, pre-scientific, religious metaphysical thinking. And here, Nietzsche radically breaks from the ideas that he developed in the first philosophy book that is ever published, the earlier The Birth of Tragedy, from 1872. There, under the strong influence of the metaphysical ideas of the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, Nietzsche held that art, especially music and Greek tragedy, can pierce into the abysmal and horrifying nature of reality and reveal to us the terrible, pessimistic truth about the all-encompassing and eternal will that lies beneath all appearances. From the standpoint of the later text, Human All Too Human, this is all just juvenile, overly enthusiastic twaddle. And indeed, Human All Too Human can be seen, as it was seen by Nietzsche, as a radical act of about-face, an act of self-overcoming, where the older self, intoxicated as it was with romantic ideas about the metaphysical power and significance of art, is criticized and cast aside, shed like snakeskin, to make room for the new self, the free spirit. It is in this spirit that Nietzsche severely criticizes received and inflated notions of the artist, of aesthetic experience, of artworks themselves, of the significance of art, and of the effects of art on the public and on the artist. Indeed, I think the force of Nietzsche's criticism is so vehement at times that I dare to say that ever since Plato's notorious attack on art, no stronger words have been directed against it by a philosopher, at least. The reason being that, according to Nietzsche, art in its various aspects can only sustain itself, can only appear to retain a measure of legitimacy by feeding on religious and metaphysical ideas that cannot be rationally maintained anymore, that have fallen into intellectual disrepute. We saw this idea at work in the section on Beethoven. The magic that a great composition can work on us, Nietzsche claims, draws its power from the illusion that it gives rise to, the illusion that something divine, supernatural, and otherworldly is being revealed to us, communicated to us, channeled to us in aesthetic experience. Nietzsche, of course, does not deny the blinding and extraordinary effect of great art, but he thinks that from the fact that aesthetic experience has this enchanting, quasi-magical character, often captured with the aid of terms such as beauty and the sublime and aura, to use Benjamin's term. From that, it doesn't follow that art indeed has a capacity to open us to any hidden dimensions of reality. First, Nietzsche holds, a cold scientific mind cannot allow itself to buy into such outlandish ideas that have no empirical grounding whatsoever and can only appear to be true for a mind steeped in religious and metaphysical ideas, a mind not sufficiently schooled in the cold and objective method of analysis of the Nietzschean free spirit. Second, Nietzsche thinks, there are natural, historical explanations of how religious meanings entered art. Thus, with respect to music, he writes in a section entitled Religious Origin of Modern Music that music of feeling comes into being within the restored Catholicism that followed the Council of Trent, that spawned the Counter-Reformation, through Palestrina, who was an Italian Renaissance religious composer, who assisted the newly awakened spirit to find utterance. Later, with Bach, it extended to Protestantism too. This is how profoundly indebted we are to the religious life. In other words, what Nietzsche is saying is that modern music, and as a consequence, great classical music, has become infused with certain feelings of a specific religious coloring and has been accordingly interpreted. But, as he says, no music is in itself deep and full of meaning. And he adds, the intellect itself has projected this meaning into the sound, as it has also read into the relationship of lines and masses in architecture, a meaning that is, however, actually quite foreign to mechanical laws. The implication seems to be that, in truth, there's nothing there in the artistic object, but what the sciences can tell us, lines and masses and the mechanical laws that govern them. All meaning everything that goes beyond the scientific truth is just a projection. Art, Nietzsche says in the section, infusion of soul into art. Art takes over a number of feelings and moods produced by religion, clasps them to its heart, and then becomes itself deeper, more soulful, so that it is able to communicate exaltation and enthusiasm, which it could not yet do before. Thus the claim, it seems, is general. He's not just talking about music. It's not just music that benefited from this intertwining with the affective and ideational palette of religion, but all art. As Nietzsche writes in the section Transcendence in Art, artists glorify mankind's religious and philosophical errors, and they could not have done so without believing in their absolute truth. Now, if belief in such truth declines at all, if the rainbow colors around the outer edges of human knowledge and imagination fade, then art, like the Divine Comedy, Raphael's paintings, Michelangelo's frescoes, Gothic cathedrals, art that presumes not only a cosmic but also metaphysical meaning in the art object, can never blossom again. There will someday be a moving legend that such an art, such an artistic faith once existed. But Nietzsche's critique of the artist goes far deeper than this. Not only is it true, Nietzsche thinks, that artists, perhaps some of the greatest artists, believed in certain religious or metaphysical ideas and that their art cannot be imagined without such presuppositions, but artists actively, Nietzsche says, actively resist any attempt to discredit such religious metaphysical notions, for they have a vested interest in preserving them. For their art, their success as artists depends on it. As Nietzsche puts it, on no account does the artist want his brilliant, profound interpretations of life to be taken from him, and he defends himself against sober, plain methods and results. Ostensibly, he is fighting for the higher dignity and meaning of man. In truth, he does not want to give up the most effective presuppositions for his art. That is, the fantastic, the mythic, uncertain, extreme. Thus, he thinks the continuation of his manner of creating is more important than a scientific dedication to truth in every form, however plain it may appear. End quote. One central idea, according to Nietzsche, that artists tremendously benefit from is the idea of genius and inspiration. Criticizing the romantic idea of the genius artist, in whose ears the muses whisper and through his mind there consequently flow brilliant images, visions, entire works that then stream almost effortlessly out through the hand to the page, the canvas, the music sheet. Nietzsche claims, as you might expect by now, that this is all mythology, and a pernicious and self-serving one at that. The artist's illusion that their art fell from the sky in one fell swoop might strengthen the erroneous belief that indeed they are channeling something of divine origin, which would only add to their glory and prestige and further solidify the metaphysical significance of art as well as certain metaphysical ideas. To debunk this mythology, Nietzsche offers, as in so many other places, a psychological, naturalistic explanation of the phenomena at issue, that of genius. He writes, when productive energy has been dammed up for a while and has been hindered in its outflow by an obstacle, there is finally a sudden outpouring, as if a direct inspiration with no previous inner working out, as if a miracle were taking place. This constitutes the well-known illusion which all artists have somewhat too great an interest in preserving. End quote. Thus, what seems to be miraculous is revealed as natural. What appears higher and full of mysterious meaning is disenchanted. A little bit of psychology and the belief in inspiration dissipates like morning dew. But not only is the idea in sudden inspiration psychologically explainable and thus demystified, Nietzsche thinks it is also possible to examine closely the actual process of creation and see what is actually going on in the atelier or study of the great artist. Thus he claims, in truth, the good artist's or thinker's imagination is continually producing things good, mediocre, and bad. But the artist's power of judgment, highly sharpened and practiced, rejects, selects, joins together. Nietzsche adduces the example of Beethoven. If we look at Beethoven's notebooks, we can see that he gradually assembled the most glorious melodies and to a degree selected them out of disparate beginnings. Hard, continuous, dirty work, then, rather than an instantaneous and immaculate conception. What then causes us to believe in genius? As we saw, artists, Nietzsche thinks, are prone to promote this idea given that it magnifies their glory. But another suggestion Nietzsche makes is the following. He says, everything that is complete and perfect is admired. Everything still becoming is underestimated. Now, no one can see in an artist's work how it has become. That is its advantage. For wherever we can see the act of becoming, we grow somewhat colder. The finished and perfect art of representation repulses all thinking as to how it has become. It tyrannizes as present completeness and perfection. This is why the masters of the art of representation count above all as gifted with genius. End quote. In other words, it is precisely because we're not privy to the gradual, messy process of creation that we tend to think, when confronted with a finished work, that it descended from the sky. And as a side note, think in this connection about a parallel case. Intelligent divine creation on the one hand, and evolution by natural selection on the other. Since the very slow and gradual process of evolution is something we don't actually observe, we are tempted to believe in a God who created all forms of life in instantaneous acts of creation. But when we think like this, Nietzsche says, we are probably still under the influence of an ancient mythological sentiment. That is, we are thinking unscientifically. Consequently, Nietzsche adds, he says, as is self-evident, the science of art must oppose the illusion most firmly and point out the false conclusions and self-indulgences of the intellect that drive it into the artist's trap. Now, in general, the treatment the artist receives in Nietzsche's discussion is unflattering to the extreme. And this, again, in sharp contrast to his earlier veneration of the artist at the time of The Birth of Tragedy, his earlier book. In Human All Too Human, the later work, Nietzsche excoriates the artist and paints him in the most unflattering of colors. We already saw that Nietzsche thinks that the artist encourages belief in illusion and miracles out of egoistic interest in self-preservation. But the harshest words, I think, are to be found in the following section, entitled Art Dangerous for the Artist, which I will now quote to you at some length. Nietzsche writes, when art seizes an individual powerfully, it draws him back to the views of those times when art flowered most vigorously. And then it effects a retrogression in him. The artist comes more and more to revere sudden excitements, believes in gods and demons, imbues nature with a soul, hates science, and desires the overthrow of all conditions that are not favorable to art. And this is with the vehemence and unreasonableness of a child. Now, Nietzsche continues, the artist, in and of himself, is already a laggard creature. In another translation, I have a retarded being, because he still plays a game that belongs to youth and childhood. To this, there is now added his gradual retrogression to earlier times. So not only is the artist, end quote, so not only is the artist interested in deceiving his audience and tarnishing their clarity of thinking, he is himself a victim of his own artistic craft, insofar as it has the effect of causing a kind of retrogression in the artist to a stage of culture where belief in mythical beings and powers was the norm, and where science was not yet available as a way of making sense of the world. But the second idea that Nietzsche introduces here is that, this pernicious effect of art aside, the artist is already a kind of laggard creature, as Nietzsche says, which we might add is perhaps another explanation for why the artist is attracted to such unscientific notions and why he exhibits resistance to scientific ideas in the first place. Now, this is not to say that the illusions that art traffics in have no value whatsoever. Here, Nietzsche retains an important idea from his earlier work and claims that art renders the sight of life bearable by laying over it the gauze of impure thinking. This is just great. Let me read that again. Art renders the sight of life bearable by laying over it the gauze of impure thinking. Art makes life bearable by falsifying it, whether by distracting us away from the horrible everyday, by making us believe in certain comforting religious or metaphysical ideas, or even by tantalizing us with the seductions of beauty. Taking up the concept of beauty, Nietzsche asks, what do we long for when we see beauty? And he answers, to be beautiful. We think much happiness must be connected with it, but that is an error. So art, as well as the artist, and as a consequence the public, are all sunk deep in outdated, magical, and mythical thinking. What is to be done? What is the future that lies ahead for art, for artists? The assumptions under which art operated and thrived, according to Nietzsche, assumptions about the power of art to reveal a true world, assumptions about the genius of the artist, about meaning in art. Such assumptions are wrong, Nietzsche says, and asks, what place remains for art, then, after this knowledge? And he answers, we could give art up. We could give it up. But, he adds, in doing so, we would not forfeit what it has taught us to do. And he says, this teaching of art, to have joy in existence, has taken root in us. It now comes to light again as an all-powerful need for knowledge. As plastic art and music are the standard for the wealth of feeling really earned and won through religion, so the intense and manifold joy in life, which art implants in us, would still demand satisfaction were art to disappear. The scientific man is a further development of the artistic man. End quote. This is in essence Nietzsche's thesis about the end of art. Art, or at least great art, grew out of and was propped up by religious and metaphysical ideas, but now that these ideas have lost all credence, art is for us a thing of the past, as Hegel formulated his idea about the end of art. But for Nietzsche, art is not to disappear completely, rather it is to flow into and nourish the scientific spirit. Specifically, it has to make possible a kind of joyful attitude to existence that would enliven the existence and activities of the scientific person who is now supposed to supersede the artist and take his or her place. Art, as the title of Nietzsche's 1882 book has it, is supposed to make possible a gay or joyful science, a joyful wisdom. It thus seems that in this middle period of his thinking, the period of the free spirit, Nietzsche held views on art very similar to those of Alexander Rosenberg, with whose views I began my talk. Art can make you feel various things, and it has value as entertainment of sorts, but it in itself lacks any world historical meaning, and its effects on the subject can be understood scientifically. What are we to make of this criticism of art? To what extent is it persuasive? I think, but I'm not so sure, so correct me if I'm wrong, in my usage of we in the following, I think that no one today would hold the view that art manages to provide us with access to some supernatural or spiritual realm, or that there is something magical or mystical about inspiration, though in parentheses I want to add that I can still hear artists talk about the universe signaling to them what to do. Our concept of genius has to a great degree undergone disenchantment as well. We still believe in innate talent, but like Nietzsche, first, we don't conceive of this talent as equipping the artist with the capacity to receive messages from some beyond, nor do we, second, think that talent without instruction and hard work can really come to anything worthwhile. But what should we think about Nietzsche's ideas regarding meaning in art? Is art itself really meaningless? Can it merely provide us with some form of sensory or emotional stimulation that can be understood, theoretically explained by the natural sciences? Is art nothing but a form of entertainment of sorts? Doesn't it possess the ability to reveal truths with a lowercase t? But what truth is left once we abandon religious and metaphysical truths and surrender all discovery and analysis of truth to the sciences or to common sense understanding? In order to offer a possible answer to these questions, I would like to move forward in time to a later period in Nietzsche's thinking, the last period of his productive life, which we can perhaps claim started at 1886 with the publication of the fifth book of the gay science and of Beyond Good and Evil, all the way to the final works of 1888, such as Twilight of the Idols and The Antichrist. Now, on the one hand, in his remarks on beauty and art, Nietzsche in this later period of his thought retains the psychological, physiological analysis and raises ideas similar to those that we encountered above, where the power of art is seen to lie in its ability to generate a life-affirming attitude. For example, apropos of his rejection of the idea of art for art's sake, Nietzsche asks, art is the great stimulus to life. How could art be understood as purposeless, pointless, l'art pour l'art? These suggestions, however, true or false as they might be, are still caught up in the reductive scientistic attitude to art, I want to say, where it is merely conceived as a kind of drug that works to excite and enliven the body and mind, an existential Viagra of sorts, if you will, one that can in principle be replaced by a chemical substance developed by the pharmaceutical industry. I would like to suggest that a more promising line of thinking could be found in Nietzsche's later reflections on art when we take into account his ideas about perspectivism. So what is perspectivism? So Nietzsche does not really clarify, he never does actually, he never really clarifies anything in a direct, straightforward, explicit way. But I think it's possible to approach perspectivism through another famous idea of Nietzsche's, namely the death of God. The death of God, announced in the gay science, means, in a nutshell, and this is a very, very small nutshell, it means that, as Nietzsche puts it, the belief in the Christian God has become unbelievable. The belief in the Christian God has become unbelievable. In other words, the death of God does not involve the annihilation or disappearance of a previously existing being, God, but rather it involves a change in our beliefs. We, and we can of course raise questions about this we, have stopped believing in God because we take such belief to be unbelievable, that is, incredible. What are the implications of this? For Nietzsche, the tremendous implications of this event can hardly be exaggerated. But while usually focus is put on the moral implications of the death of God, I want to focus my attention on the epistemological implications, that is, on the consequences that the death of God has for how we should think about knowledge and truth. So in the philosophical tradition, on top of being all-powerful and all-good, God is in addition conceived as an all-knowing being. Roughly what this has meant, again for philosophers, is that God knows all reality. Nothing escapes God's sight. And he knows reality as it is, not as it appears to be. And where all the different parts of this reality, like in a jigsaw puzzle, are held together in a synoptic, internally coherent, all-encompassing view. Since this is how God knows the world, this is for us, human beings, the ideal to strive to in our scientific endeavors. We want our knowledge of the world to coincide with God's, for then we will have perfect and absolute knowledge. Now, Nietzsche's idea is that when we reject the belief in God, we are at the same time committed to rejecting the divine conception of knowledge that I just outlined. For the force of this picture of what knowledge is derives from any authority that the conception of God might have over us. Thus, the death of God spells a revision in our understanding of knowledge. Our cognitive access to the world, Nietzsche holds, should not be conceived merely as an inherently limited attempt to know reality from God's point of view, since this divine point of view does not exist. Rather than think about knowledge as total, all-encompassing, pure, impersonal, and internally coherent, rather than think of it, in other words, as providing us with a complete view from nowhere, to use philosopher Thomas Nagel's phrase, we should appreciate that cognitive access to the world is always local, always piecemeal, always personal. That is, always mediated through our cognitive capacities, our concepts and our theories, always couched in our vocabulary, and always reflective of our interests, needs, and affective dispositions. It is always plural. In other words, cognition for Nietzsche is always perspectival, from a specific perspective, and it generates different interpretations. Moreover, what is revealed in these various perspective-dependent interpretations cannot necessarily be joined together to form a complete and wrinkle-free picture. Some perspectival interpretations or views do not, unlike jigsaw puzzle pieces, they do not fit together neatly to form a whole. They might, in other words, be incommensurable. It thus follows, and I'm circling back to where I began, that a corollary of the death of God, something which I think is perhaps not appreciated enough or too often, is the death of scientism. Nietzsche could be seen to draw this conclusion himself in a section from the 1886 edition of the Gay Science, that is entitled Science as a Prejudice. Thus, and I quote Nietzsche at some length, Nietzsche speaks of, quote, the faith with which so many materialistic natural scientists rest content nowadays, the faith in a world that is supposed to have its equivalent and its measure in human thought and human valuations, a world of truth that can be mastered completely and forever with the aid of our square little reason. What? Do we really want to permit existence to be degraded for us like this, reduced to a mere exercise for a calculator and an indoor diversion for mathematicians? Above all, one should not wish to divest existence of its rich ambiguity. That the only justifiable interpretation of the world should be one that permits counting, calculating, weighing, seeing, touching, and nothing more, that is a crudity and a naivete, assuming that it is not a mental illness, an idiocy. A scientific interpretation of the world as you understand it, dear scientists, Nietzsche says, might therefore still be one of the most stupid of all possible interpretations of the world, meaning that it would be one of the poorest in meaning. An essentially mechanical world would be an essentially meaningless world. End quote. In other words, Nietzsche is here explicitly claiming that the scientific attitude characteristic of scientism that wishes to reduce the entire world to what can be measured and quantified might be the most superficial, since it would vacuum all meaning out of the world. Sometimes to discover the truth about things, one indeed has to be cold. But at other times, if one is too cold, one might freeze things to death. And this applies directly to the question of meaning and truth in art. Thus, Nietzsche writes in the same section that I just quoted, he says, assuming that one estimated the value of a piece of music according to how much of it could be counted, calculated, and expressed in formulas, how absurd would such a scientific estimation of music be? What one would have comprehended, understood, grasped of it? Nothing, really nothing of what is music in it. End quote. In other words, a scientific analysis of music that reduces pieces of music to sound waves, frequencies, air modulations, maybe even synapses in the brain, would completely fail to capture, first, the very qualitative nature of the acoustic experience, namely the what it's like character of sound and harmony and melody. Secondly, it would fail to capture the meaning of the work, what is music in it, as Nietzsche puts it. And third, it would fail to capture the value of the work, whether it's good or bad. Thus, in contrast to Alex Rosenberg's reductive view, music cannot be properly understood as he puts it, the acoustical disturbance produced by the condensation and rarefication of oxygen and nitrogen, etc. Furthermore, to the extent that Nietzsche found this scientistic view of music or art in general appealing in his free spirit phase, then it follows that in his later perspectivism, he overcame this way of thinking and perhaps makes room for a different way to approach the work of art. Now, this is not to assert that what science tells us is false, or that the scientific perspective is worthless, but that it is just one perspective, one interpretation, out of potentially infinite perspectives and interpretations. The world, Nietzsche says, is richly ambiguous, meaning that it could be approached from a myriad of different perspectives that may be enlightening in their own way. Importantly, however, this does not mean that all possible interpretations are equally good or equally valid. Nietzsche, in my view, never subscribed to this relativistic or postmodern outlook. In fact, he quite often describes certain perspectives as foolish, or as we just saw, plain stupid. But what meaning or what truths can art make accessible if it is not the empirical truths that science or even our everyday understanding can discover and access? While Nietzsche, I think, does not give a direct answer to this question, I believe an implicit beginning of an answer could be found in his description of a piece of music composed by his erstwhile mentor and father figure, Richard Wagner. In a section from his 1886 Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche writes the following, and again I quote him at some length. This is a difficult passage. So he writes this: "I have heard once again for the first time." That in itself is a very weird formulation. Once again for the first time. "I have heard once again and for the first time Richard Wagner's overture to the Meistersinger," which is an opera that Wagner composed in 1867. "It is a magnificent, overladen, heavy and late art which has the pride to presuppose for its understanding that 2 centuries of music are still living. What forces and juices, what seasons and zones are not mixed together here. Now it seems archaic, now strange, acid and too young. It is as arbitrary as it is pompous traditional. It has fire and spirit, and at the same time the loose yellow skin of fruits which ripen too late. Something German in the best and worst sense of the word, something manifold, a certain German powerfulness and overfullness of soul, which is not afraid to hide itself among the refinements of decay. A true, genuine token of the German soul, which is at once young and aged, over-mellow and still too rich in future. This kind of music best expresses what I consider true of the Germans. They are of the day before yesterday and the day after tomorrow. They have as yet no today." End quote. Now, though it is difficult to do so, I want to put aside the entire complex and problematic context of 20th century horrors, on the background of which we might want to read this difficult passage, as well as questions regarding Nietzsche's vexed and ambivalent relation to Wagner and his music and the Germans in general. And I want to make the suggestion that here we have an example of the kind of insights that art, in this case music, can make available to us. For here Nietzsche is basically articulating to us what is music in this piece of music, in Wagner's overture. Because here, in this piece of music, in Nietzsche's eyes, the overture opens a window to the German soul in the late 19th century. It is by means of this piece of music that we can catch a glimpse of the spirit of the German nation, Nietzsche thinks, caught as it is between its rich and overburdening past and its great future potential, which it is at present perhaps groping its way towards. To generalize my claim here, we can say that art, the perspective of art, makes accessible truths regarding society, culture, the spirit of a certain people or even of certain individuals, truths that are inaccessible from the perspective of science. Indeed, how can the natural sciences ever discover what Nietzsche sees in the overture? So truths that are inaccessible from the perspective of science, or it can also make truths that are otherwise known or potentially knowable accessible to us in a different way. I leave many questions open and unattended, but I hope to have shown that despite Nietzsche's earlier science-inspired, tough-minded approach to art, in the later and last period of his life, due to his doctrine of perspectivism, he came to see such an approach as overly reductive. Importantly, perspectivism does not deny the immense cognitive contributions of the various sciences, nor should it be seen as opening the door to some kind of rampant relativism. Rather, it emphasizes the richness of reality and how different approaches to reality could be illuminating and informative. Indeed, specifically with respect to art, I think it's possible to make the stronger claim that only perspectivism, insofar as it rejects reductive materialism and scientism in its various forms, can make room for the cognitively independent contribution of the arts. Thank you.